All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about API class-based views in Django, along with some testing and some URL converters. In part one, we'll be covering what are class-based views, building model view controllers through API views, linking URL patterns from project to apps, creating the all Pokemon view, creating the all moves view, and then we'll go over how to create our own URL converters and testing API view responses. Now, a lot of what your assessment in Django is going to be API view responses. So this portion of testing is going to be pretty important, and we're going to make sure we dedicate quite a bit of time into the testing portion of today's lecture. At this point, does anyone have any questions over what we'll be going over today? Go ahead, Brian.
Sir, are we going to be expected to write a whole bunch of tests on the assessment and have those tests that we write pass, or are we doing like we usually do, is write code that conforms to the tests that are provided to us?
For the assessment, you're going to be provided a test suite that will be expected to pass. So it's kind of what we've done before. The rest of the project, the only thing that will be getting tested will be the responses from your API views. The rest of your entire application, as far as models, serializers, or anything else that you have to build in order to actually create the API. That's up to you whether you create tests or not for it, but that is not what will be graded. Does that answer your question, Brian?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Of course. Will?
Yeah, would you say that views are the Django equivalent of React components, or am I off there?
I would say that each app would be the equivalent to a component, right? And then within the app, your axials calls or any sort of function that you have in order to render content, that's the equivalent to views. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Awesome. All right, so now let's go ahead and knock into our views lecture here. So we're going to start building a RESTful API. We've made our Django ORM pretty well. We have serializers, we have some validators. Our data is being entered into our database in a secure manner, and we have everything to ensure that all the data that goes into our database is the way we want it to. That's great. Yesterday, we covered how to serialize the data that comes back from the query set, but after I serialized it, we never really covered why it is that I want it serialized. I mentioned that it needs to be in that format in order to be sent over HTTP responses, but how do we send HTTP responses? Well, that's what we're going to be covering today. So here's the RESTful API framework, right? We have our server itself, and we have the database. So our database that we're working on is PostgreSQL, and the web server that we are currently using is ran by Django. And then you have your website and application, which that would be your React front end. Now, this whole cloud portion of the RESTful API, that would be if your backend was running on a completely separate server. So if we think about this back to the Rick and Morty API, right? You made an application for the Rick and Morty exercise that would send requests over to their API location, which is just some place inside of the internet where this server is leaving. That request would get forwarded by the internet to the server. The server would then grab that request and say, hey, we can talk. And if it did talk, then it would route that request over to an API view. That API view will likely have it talk to a database, maybe, maybe not, but the intent is to grab responses from the database. Does anyone have any questions over this quick overview of what's going on here? Okay, if no one has any questions, can somebody read through this slide, please?
Think about Facebook or Instagram. All the information we see on our screen is not already loaded in the application. Instead, when you open the application, a request is sent, grab all of the posts that may pertain to you to then render it in HTML for the user.
Awesome. Yeah. So if we think about Facebook or Instagram, especially Instagram, right? Instagram is essentially one specific component being rendered over and over and over and over again, right? Every single post that gets sent into Instagram falls into one component where it renders an image, it renders how many times it was liked, how many comments there is, and then it renders the description or whatever somebody added to that image. And that's it. That's just one component. Well, where does those images, comments, and number of likes come from? Well, when you load the application, a request gets sent from your front end application to the server to grab that information so it could render it for you on the screen. All right. So when you open up Facebook, there's some sort of function that's making a HTTP request to a RESTful API that's being hosted somewhere on the internet. In this specific example, we're talking about a GET request to a URL that may resemble something like this. So we can see that we have the host of HTTP. This is likely an HTTPS, facebook.com. And then it specifies, hey, this is an API endpoint. This is version 1. Who knows what version they're currently on? And then the endpoint is usually a noun that's pluralized. So in this case, what we want is the post. So we'll have post as the noun with an S for pluralization. All right, that request gets sent. All posts get pulled out of the database by a post.objects.all, where user ID or related ID is equal to this current user. It grabs all of the posts, and that gets returned to the front end. All right, so here's the web server portion. Can somebody read the slide, please?
The request was sent to our, oh, sorry, Tom.
The request is sent to our hosted endpoint and is then passed to the server hosting, handling these URL endpoints. Facebook is loading and is waiting for the server to send back a response with all the posts and information it wants to show to the user.
So just like in the front end module, when we're working with Axios and building our requests, we had to make an asynchronous request, all right? And we had to tell that asynchronous request, hey, you have to wait for the response to come back from the server. Well, the server has just accepted the response, and it's using the URL patterns to figure out which API view to trigger in order to formulate a response. So finally, the server may or may not query the database to run one of the following operations. It will either get some information, it will put, which is the equivalent of update some information in the database. It will post, which means create information into the database, or delete information out of the database. Now, the Facebook server will eventually run a query of whatever action it is that it's supposed to do regarding this post, and it's going to update or grab the information that's within the database. Once that's completed, it gets returned over to the server, over to the application, over to the server, then back to the application so that content can get rendered into, I apologize, everyone, into your front end framework. So here we have the cycle, all right? So here's your front end application that you build with React. You send a request for characters to the Rick and Morty API. So here we have get all characters. Great. So that's my JavaScript function. It goes over to the Rick and Morty API, to their web address. That gets accepted by whatever virtual machine is running on that location of the internet. That virtual machine then accepts that request and sends it over to our Django server. Our Django server then gets routed and says, all right, well, this URL pattern should be working with this API view. That API view runs a grab all characters from grab all from characters. So that runs to the database. The database returns a query set to the server, which is the API view. The API view then uses a serializer to format that information, returns it to the virtual machine, and the virtual machine then returns that to our React application. And that's the entire cycle. So far, we've been covering this portion back here of just concentrating on the communication between the web server and our database. But today, we're going to bridge the gap and ensure that we can actually accept requests and return responses to front-end applications. Does anyone have any questions about the I guess, cycle of operations of this making requests and receiving responses. All right, doesn't look like there are any questions, so let's go into some practical application here. So we're going to be covering how to make class-based views today. Yesterday, when we covered our project and we went into our URL patterns, we made function-based views. So these are function-based views because they're quite literally just a function. But what we're going to do is we're going to take these functions and we're going to make them respond to different sort of methods depending on what's actually coming through a request, whether it's a get, put, post, or delete. So we'll be utilizing Django REST framework in order to do this. And I'm going to go ahead and start from the Pokemon section. So I'm going to go over to the Pokemon app. And in the Pokemon app, there is a file named views. Now here in the views is where I'm going to actually create my my Pokemon view that will return all of my Pokemon. Well, what would that look like if I wanted to make a class-based view? So let's make it a class. Let's say def get all Pokemon, and it takes in a request. How could I go about getting all of the Pokemon from my database and returning a response? All right, so let's concentrate on the first part. How do I get all of the Pokemon out of the database? Go ahead, Brian.
So I was going to suggest using like a view, but I guess we're just doing it like basic. So we want to import the Pokemon class.
Right, so from that models, import Pokemon. All right.
And then we want to do the Pokemons equals Pokemon.objects.all.
Great. So that's going to give me all of my Pokemon saved under the variable Pokemons. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. Now this works as far as grabbing all of the information out of my database. But now I can't send this over HTTP responses because it's a query set. So how do I turn this query set into serialized objects of data?
You would then use your serializer there, wouldn't you?
Awesome. So let's go ahead and go from .serializers, import Pokemon serializer, and I'm gonna actually import Pokemon from there as well. All right, so let's go with serialized Pokemons. And let's make this the Pokemon serializer, where the data it is going to fix is Pokemons. Is there another argument that I need to pass into the serializer?
Many equals true.
Nice. I need to pass in many equals true because this is going to be a list that it needs to iterate through. All right. Well, now I could return, and this is where Django kind of gets a little bit tricky. If I go into Django.http, I could import a couple of responses. And let me go ahead and type in response here. And so here we can see a little bit of error handling. It has a couple of different HTTP responses. We have bad requests, which usually aligns with, I believe it's 400. We have forbidden, which is 401. We have gone, whereas in this URL that no longer exists. Not allowed, which is almost the same thing as forbidden, but just it's different. One has to do with permissions. The other one has to do with account type. Then we have 404 not found. It's not showing us the codes that it responds to, which kind of makes it a little bit difficult as far as which one to choose. Then we have our HTTP response, but in this case, what we're returning is JSON data. So I'm going to go ahead and import JSON response. So I'm going to say I want to return a JSON response of serialized Pokemon dot data. Okay. So let's take a look at what we just did. We imported into our views this Pokemon serializer and a Pokemon. We grabbed all of the Pokemon from our database. We serialized those Pokemons utilizing the Pokemon serializer that we built out yesterday. And we returned a JSON response utilizing that data from the serialized Pokemons. Great. But this isn't connected just yet, right? Yesterday, when we took a look at our project, the way we linked or the way our project accepts requests and returns responses is through our URL patterns. So currently, I don't have any URL patterns that will trigger that function. I have these function-based views up here that are working with these patterns, but I don't have anything that's working with get all Pokemon. So I have to figure out a way to link this app to my Pokemon project and tell the URLs to trigger this function. So let's go into our URL patterns real quick and take a look at how this works. If I go over to my URLs, I'm going to go ahead and go to my import statement up here from Django.urls import path. And I'm going to also bring in include. Now, include is a separate function that falls within path. So if I go to path, oh, and I forgot to place a comma up here. I'm going to say at path API v1 slash Pokemon slash I want to include Pokemon app.urls. And that's all going to be within a string. So what am I doing here? Well, just like before, there is a function that is going to be triggered when a path or URL pattern is met. So we'll go to API v1 Pokemon, and it will then include all of the URLs within my Pokemon app. But my Pokemon app does not have a URLs file. So I have to create one. I'll go ahead and say urls.py. All right, from there, I can say from Django.urls import path. I can make a URL pattern section. And I can start a path for an empty string where I will trigger the view that I just created. So now I can go up here, say from.views import get all Pokemon. And now I can trigger get all Pokemon. All right, so let's take a look at our request behavior as to what's going on here. I'm going to run the server. When the server accepts the request, it's going to take a look at my URL patterns. And in this request, it's going to match API/v1/Pokemon. And it's going to know, okay, well, since this is the URL pattern that's following so far, I have to include Pokemon app.urls. So I will look inside of my Pokemon app, find a URLs file. It will check for the empty path and trigger the API view or function-based view for get all Pokemon. And in get all Pokemon, all it's going to do is grab all of the Pokemon from my database, serialize said Pokemon from the database, and return the JSON data as a response. Does anyone have any questions about how we connected our URL patterns to this view? All right, I don't see anything in the Whiskey questions channel or in here. So I'm going to go ahead and put this to practice. Let's see what's going on. I'm going to Python. Oh. run my server. We can see that my server is running. I didn't make any changes to my database, so I don't have to worry about migrations or migrating. And I'm just going to simply send a request here. Let me open up Thunder Client. All right, so in Thunder Client, I'm going to go ahead and send a request to to 127.0.0.1 port 8000. From there, I know that I have to ping API/v1/Pokemon. And from there, all I have is an empty path, so there's nothing following this string. Okay, so now if I send my request, I get a 500 here where I get, in order to allow a non-dict object to be serialized, set the safe parameter to false. Where is this coming from? Interesting. There is something going on within this view. Let me take a look here. Oh, I remember now. So because it is a JSON response, I have to have this in a dictionary format. There you go. So now I'm going to have to make a key for Pokemons where it will have that array of objects within it. There you go. All right, so now we can see that we have our key of Pokemons where my array of Pokemon objects is within it. All through the serializer so that it also knows the different moves that belong to said Pokemon. All right, I'm going to open up the floor here for questions. Go ahead, Jens.
Is there any place here where we specifically said that this is going to be a get method and only a get method?
No, there is nowhere here where we have said that. So technically I can send any kind of request, right? If I send a post request, it seems to be forbidden. This one's because I don't have a CSRF token, which we'll go into later. Oh, nice. It's not allowing anything due to the CSRF token, which is good. But currently this get request is the only one that's functioning, even though we never specified it. And we'll go into CSRF tokens. Actually, we won't be covering CSRF tokens because we won't need them due to the API view, but this is a good example of what the API view brings into play. Does that answer your question, Jens?
Yeah, I was just wondering if it's handled under the hood, if that's going to be another step ahead.
Yeah, let me see if I could. I have to figure out where to grab that CSRF token from so that we could do it. But there's a way to make this function work for all the different methods. But that's exactly the next problem that we're going to be going into. Does anyone else have any other questions before I fully answer that, Jens? Okay, good. So let's actually address that. Like we just saw, we can't accept any sort of other method. We haven't specified that we can accept those methods, nor have we given this view a way to only recognize that the only thing it can take in is a get request. Well, how do I fix that? This is where Django REST frameworks comes into play. Currently, I'm utilizing a Django HTTP response, and I have a function-based view. Well, instead, I'm going to say from REST framework, I want to import API. Oh, I want to import API views. Then I'm going to say from REST framework dot response, I want to import response. So here we go. We have my API view and the response. Now this API view starts with a capital A. So that tells me that this is a class, right? I can take a look at it and see this is a class API view, and it tells me a bunch of other things that it has available to it for me to be able to work with. So and then here we see the allowed methods of what's actually able to be allowed within Django or this API view. We can see a couple of other methods that belong there. You could set up a throttle. Things for getting authentication headers. There's a lot of functionality that comes in from that API view. Now, how do I turn this function-based view into a class-based view? Well, all I need to do is say class all Pokemon. It's going to inherit from API view. And it's going to have a method named get. So now I have a get method that is going to be triggered by API views. And now I see an error here that's coming from views. I'm going to fix that later on. But now this method here is only going to be triggered when this class receives a get request. So now I just limited my amount of requests that I will accept and explicitly told my views, this method here is only for get request. Any other request that gets sent should trigger a different method. So later on, we will have something like the put, which will have self and request. We'll have something that says post. And we'll have something that says delete. We're not going to use any of those, but that is how you would make methods for the other kinds of requests. Does that address your question now, Jens?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right, great. So now I have a method here named get request. But currently all it's accepting is a request. This is still OP. So every method's first argument should be what?
Self.
Yeah, I'm missing self, comma, request. So it could reference the request. It will trigger this information. But now I'm currently returning a JSON response, and it forces me to place everything inside of a dictionary. Well, that's not necessarily what I want, right? Instead, what I want to utilize is this response variable. So now I'm going to go ahead and use response. And the difference between JSON response and response is that response can return string, it can return numbers, it can return one specific thing rather than returning something being enforced as to being within a dictionary. So you could just return response serialized Pokemon.data, which is a list of objects. All right. Well, now there's one small problem here, right? If I were to try to run my server now, I'm going to get an error telling me, hey, this get all Pokemon doesn't exist. Well, that's coming from my URL patterns. I'm currently utilizing a class or a function named get all Pokemon, which doesn't exist. Instead, I'm gonna switch that to all Pokemon. And I want us to see the error that comes up when I sent a request in here. Oh, look at that. I didn't even get the error. So here we can see something that comes back from Django system checks. And it's telling me, hey, we have an issue. You're trying to use a URL pattern that has a class-based view, but you're trying to send it in as just a pure class. It tells me you can't do that. If you want to utilize a class as a view, you have to specify use this class with the method dot as view. So I'm gonna add that method. Great. So now I have this Pokemon view that will get triggered when I send my request. So if I send my request, I get this 200 okay. We can see that it was able to accept a GET request and it returned all of my information. Right? If I try to send something like a post method and I send it now, we can see that post was actually able to get rendered, but it returned a 405 not allowed for me. Even though I didn't specify it anywhere in my views, this API view class is handling that error for me. It's saying this is what we'll tell the user for you. That way you don't have to worry about it. So now they get a 405 response saying, hey, this method post is not allowed. And it's saying it's not allowed because I simply don't have a post method. If I were to bring this in and say return response allowed, and I send the request now, well, now all we get back is a string named allowed, right? So the name of these class methods correlate to the request. Okay. Does anyone have any questions over how to build a class-based view that connects to your project URL patterns and returns responses? Go ahead, Luis.
So in your get method, you have self and request, and then you don't call requests at all in the get method. Is the request is solely just so that you can use like get, put, post, or delete, right? Is there any other purpose of it?
Yeah, let's take a look at that real quick. So this body here in the request, right, accepts JSON. So far, what we've gone over for is something along the lines of, and let me actually specify it over here. So the equivalent of this request in JavaScript would be something like axios.get. This would probably like let response be equal to axios.get. And then this would have the same URL here. Probably want to utilize a wait. And that's what triggers this function here, right? And that's so far everything we've done as far as making requests, unless you've gone ahead yourself and made something different. Well, if you want to add a body to your request, you could do that by opening a code block. That takes in an object where you can specify a couple of things. So for example, I could put name in here and say, hey, this is Charizard. And that's what would get sent in the body of the request. And actually, let me make sure that we're not covering this today, because if we are covering it today, I may be going too far ahead. Okay. So now I send this information, right? Well, in the body of a request, we can also access that information. So let's say I want to print request.body. So I'm going to open up my object here, my object is going to take in the key of name, and it's going to send Charizard. Now, when I send that request, we can see that there is a body inside of my request where I am asking for the name, or I'm giving a key of name with the value of Charizard. Now, this is going to be acceptable through the request. There's a couple of other things that come through requests. We'll mainly be using these for put, post, and delete methods. Does that answer your question, Lewis?
It does, yeah. And just to verify, so in this instance, we're not using request for anything. Is that correct? Like, could you run this whole thing without request being in that method at all?
Oh, I see. As in, could I remove request? You cannot. You cannot remove the request argument because it's going to take in a request as a parameter, right? So every time you send an actual request, it gets passed into the API view. So currently I'm getting an error saying, hey, this only takes one positional argument, or it takes one positional argument, but two were given. So the first one being the class instance self, and the second one needs to be the request.
Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Of course. All right. So now that we've taken a look at that information, we can go ahead and build the same behavior for all moves. I walked us pretty much step by step for creating this behavior for all Pokemon, but now I would like the class to walk me through creating the behavior for all moves. I want to make a class-based view that returns all of the moves that currently lives within my database. How could I do that? All right, let's start from the beginning. How do I connect my URL patterns from my project to my Move app? Go ahead, Luis.
You need to start in your project URLs,
Okay,
and
awesome.
then we'll go in there and set up a path for it.
Nice. So I'll set up a path that follows RESTful API naming conventions. All right. What's next?
And then just like the one above it, we'll do includes and then probably just moves around rails.
All right, great. So now we have my API, my path for this API moves, our URLs. Let's see. Chris, what would be the next step here?
So now we would actually go inside the URLs and Move app, right?
All right, let's go into Move Apps, create a URLs PY. All right.
And then define a class named all moves.
Okay, where would I want to define that class? In my URLs or inside my views.py?
Oh, sorry, that would be under the views.py.
Okay, so let's go over to the views.py. All right, and let me have somebody else help me with this views part. Let's see. Taryn, so what do I need to import in order to build out my API view?
Sorry, I'm looking for it in the curriculum. I might need to phone a friend.
All right.
Yeah, could I phone a friend for that one?
Yeah, of course.
Sure, I got you. So you're gonna import your serializer from dot serializers, import did you call it move serializer? Yep. And then potentially move the class. All right, from Django.http. Well, actually, you don't need that, do you? Import. So REST framework.views, import API view. And then REST framework.response, import response. And then you're gonna go beneath line 5, create a class, call it all moves. And that's gonna take API view.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, David. I'm gonna
Yep.
pass it off to someone else here. Let's see.
I have a quick question.
Oh, yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Um, can you elaborate on importing move? Is that the actual move model, but coming from the serializers file and not the models file? Or can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, definitely. If you go over to serializers, here I already imported the move model from .models, so it's accessible to me from this file. So in this views, I could just, when I reference that .serializers file, I can grab both classes from there, since it's already
Okay. That's cool. I didn't know you could do that. Thank you.
yeah, no problem at all. All right, so now I have my class all moves, and let's see. Oh, Nathan, go ahead.
Yeah, so you would go create a function. So you do def get self comma request, and then you do move equals move serializer, and then parentheses, and then you do move dot objects. And I guess we could do order. On my look in the curriculum, is an order by and then name to kind of sort it by that. I think that's what that's doing. And then you would do mini equals true because we're doing all the moves.
Nice. So we're using a different type of query to grab all of the moves within my move class, and I'm grabbing it and sorting them by name. Okay, awesome. And then I'm serializing that information. What's next?
Return response moves dot data.
Nice. Okay, so now I have this information built out. I have my URLs from my Pokemon project pointing to the URLs inside of my Move app, but currently my views aren't talking to my project URLs. So how do I fix that in this file? And let's see. Go ahead, Sean.
You're gonna want to hold on, let me find the import. Mm. You're gonna want to do the from Django URLs import path. And then from .views import the all moves.
Nice.
And then you're gonna want to do URL patterns equal and then the square brackets. And then path parentheses empty string, comma, all moves as view, parentheses, comma, name equals all moves.
Awesome. Yeah, we're gonna give it a name convention. Let's give it a name parameter, and we'll go into this name parameter and what it's used for here shortly. All right, so here I have my all moves. Everything's working pretty well. Sometimes your server won't be able to register the new updates, but there we go. We have an all moves path. So when I send my request, it's going to my URL projects. It'll go into API v1 moves. Look into my move app URLs, find the empty path, and trigger all moves as a view. It will then go into my view. If it receives a get request, it will trigger the get method. The get method will then grab all of my moves from the database and sort them by name. My move serializer will then iterate through that list thanks to this many equals true and serialize each individual object within the list. And then it will return the moves data. So let's run that. I'm going to go ahead and run this request over to moves. And now we can see that I have my move of ID for psychic. I have slap, water pulse. Oh, and it did sort it by name. Nice. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, so if we change that to, what was it, this order by ID, it would put it in like numerical order.
Yeah, so if we changed it to order by ID, it would then format by the IDs request.
Nice, nice.
Awesome. All right. So now I've created a view for both my Pokemon and moves. Does anyone have any questions over how to create a class-based view or connect your URL patterns from your project to talk to each app's individual view files? Go ahead, Natalie.
Can you talk about what the dot as view is doing? Why can't we just put like the name of the class, I guess? I know before it was the name of the function, but now we have a class, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. So this dot as view, or what's exactly going on whenever I pass a class into my URL patterns? Well, when I pass a class into my URL patterns don't expect a class to be its function that it's supposed to be called. The way this was originally designed is so that it can work with functions. It needs to know which function it needs to trigger, right? So now we're trying to tell this path, hey, I want you to utilize this class. And the path method or function is saying, whoa, I can't utilize a class. I'm only supposed to utilize a function. I don't know why you're trying to give me a class, but this is wrong. I'm not going to take this as an acceptable input. So our all views is inheriting from API views from Django REST framework, which gives us access to this .as view method. And what this .as view method is, it forces an evaluation, which essentially turns this view method or this view class into a into a function and tells the URLs, hey, you're going to utilize this class as if it were a function. And that's what allows it to be acceptable by the URL path. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
Yeah, so does it like basically go in the class and then look for the different methods that you define there, like the get or put or whatever else?
Right, and then it returns the correct method for the request. Yes.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Of course. Go ahead, Lewis.
In this URLs pattern for moves versus the one we did earlier for Pokemon, we specified a blank, like an empty, basically the two quotation marks in front of the path. From what I get is that the purpose of that is so we can specify multiple URL patterns, then it'll concatenate whatever we put specifically there onto our existing like URL name in our URLs in our project folder.
Yeah, so essentially what's going on here is, one, we're separating the URLs within the project, right? Let me grab this URL pattern here. So essentially everything within the app is already prefaced by http://127.0.0.1 and then the API endpoint that we have. All right, so this is the first thing that gets rendered by the API views. And then anything following this would fall under this URL parameters. Because there is nothing following it, it triggers the empty path to trigger this as a view. Does that answer your question, Lewis?
It does, yeah. So in our Pokemon URLs.py where we didn't specify that like empty string with two quotations, if we put multiple ones, I assume we'd get like an error in that case.
I believe we in Pokemon URLs.py we did.
Oh, we did. My bad.
Yeah, of course, no problem. All right. Okay, great. If there aren't any questions, currently it is 9:50. I'm going to go ahead and let us go in 30 minutes of work time to work on the API view exercise. We do have retro today, so let's make it 40 minutes and come back at 10:30 to tackle the second portion of our lesson. I'm going to stop the recording. All right, so here we go. We just covered how to build an API view that will grab everything out of our database pertaining to one model. Well, what if we wanted to just grab one? Well, here's where Django URL parameters come in. We learned about this yesterday a little bit in our intro to the Django server, that we can pass actual parameters either in string or as integers through our URL patterns. So here we can see an example where we're passing 1 as the integer, or we're passing coding as the string. So here's what it would look like. Our URL pattern would be an integer with the parameter name of ID. We would have a view named selected post.as view. So here's our API view class. And then that would be what the virtual machine receives, which then gets routed to the server at the API view level, which then gets routed to the database. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how to pass URL parameters or how this functionality would work as far as grabbing one specific instance from the database? Okay, if there aren't any questions, let's go ahead and put this into action. Currently, we made an API view for grabbing all of the Pokemon. But what if I just wanted to grab one Pokemon? Kind of like the Poke API, right? Well, let's say I wanted to grab this one Pokemon by ID. I'm gonna go over to the Pokemon app, go into my views, and I'm gonna make a brand new view. Because currently these views here for all Pokemon is not supposed to receive an additional parameter. So I want to make a brand new view. And I apologize, I'm trying to compensate for some space here. Perfect. This view is going to name class A Pokemon because it's only going to be grabbing one instance. And I'm going to give it a get method that will still receive self, request, and the ID parameter. From there, I can grab a Pokemon from my database by saying Pokemon.objects.get. And here's where I pass where ID is equal to ID. I'm going to serialize said Pokemon with my Pokemon serializer. And I'm going to return a response with this serialized Pokemon dot data. All right, so here I have my view. It's going to take in a request and a parameter of ID. I am then going to grab from the database with select all from Pokemon, where ID is equal to the ID that I pass in as a parameter. And then I'm going to serialize said Pokemon and return the .data attribute. All right. Well, now let's connect that to our URL patterns. Well, let's go into my project. It goes to Pokemon/v1/Pokemon, and then it looks into my URL patterns in my Pokemon app. Comes over my URL patterns in my Pokemon app. And now all I wanted to do is accept a new pattern named path. integer ID slash, and this is going to utilize the view that I just created named a Pokemon as view. All right. So let's do a quick overview of what's going to happen when the request gets sent. So the request gets sent, it's being accepted by our server, and it's trying to match our URL patterns. It says, all right, well, API slash v1 slash Pokemon matches the URL pattern that I need to go to. It's going to include Pokemon app.urls. In Pokemon app.urls, it will either trigger the empty string, meaning there's nothing following it, or it will trigger where the ID is included inside of my parameter. If the ID is included, it will then trigger the A Pokemon class as a view. The A Pokemon class has a get method. So if I receive a get request, this get method will then get activated. It will receive the ID as a parameter, grab the Pokemon from the database, serialize this Pokemon from our database, and then return it as a response. So let's take a look here. Let me go ahead and go into, where is my Thunder client? All right, Thunder client has disappeared. So let's go ahead and bring up Thunder client real quick. So here's my request from earlier. But now I'm going to go to Pokemon. This is going to bring all of my Pokemon. And if I want to grab one by the ID, well, let's see, what's the last Pokemon I have here? I can say 6, send that request, and then we'll return that one Pokemon Poliwag. All right, this is great. Not only does Django REST framework provide me a way to create some methods, so far we've been doing everything to Thunder client, but there's actually something else that Django REST frameworks has to offer for us. If I press escape here and I type in this URL into my browser, when this request is sent and returned, we can see that we have some HTML that gets rendered by Django REST framework. Now, where is this coming from? Okay. All right, looks like my browser is freaking out. Let me go ahead and fix that real quick. There you go. All right, now where's this coming from? Where's this template actually coming from? It is coming from the fact that we're utilizing the response class from REST framework. If this is not attached to some sort of front-end framework or some front-end environment, it knows to render this nice portal for me. And here it makes it kind of as simple as Thunder client, right? I can pick which method it is that I want to grab, which format I want to grab things in. I can take a look at some options to see what this information is coming through. If I had other methods here, it would also know that I could send put or post request. All right, I could change this information if I wanted to. It would happen at the URL level, so I could change this over to 1. And when I run it, it still works. It returns Pikachu. And this is all coming from Django REST frameworks. Well, that's awesome. That's able to work pretty well. I'm able to grab one specific Pokemon. But then there comes a couple of issues. What happens if I try to grab a Pokemon that doesn't exist? Well, if I try to grab a Pokemon that doesn't exist, I get this does not exist thing, or this does not exist message. But let's pay attention to my response error that's coming back here. I'm getting this HTTP 500, meaning that there's an internal server error. It's saying, hey, whoever made this program, or whoever made this API did not handle this error, or did not expect for someone to send this request, and there is a programming problem. That means that it is the developer's fault, right? So if that's the developer's fault, how do I fix this so that I can grab a Pokemon or return a 404 not found? to my client. Well, Django actually comes built in with that scenario. I'm going to say from Django.shortcuts, I want to import get object or 404. Now this function takes in the class that I want to grab and then the argument or query that it is that I want to run. Now get object or 404 works for only one instance, which is perfect in this case. Instead of grabbing this Pokemon.objects.get, I'm going to say get object or 404. I'm going to pass in the Pokemon class. And then I'm going to pass in where the ID is equal to ID. All right, well, now let's see what happens when I send this request again. Okay. Well, now I send the request again, and instead of giving me an error or saying, hey, this is the developer's fault, it's telling the user HTTP 404 not found. And it even says there's no Pokemon matches the given query. I never made that message. This is all coming from get object or 404. It tried to grab an object. Because it was unsuccessful, it automatically returned a 404 response to my user that's already being handled and pre-formatted for me. Does anyone have any questions over how to grab one specific object from my database, how to utilize the shortcut get object or 404, or how to create a dynamic URL route that can pass in parameters to my views? Go ahead, Jens.
So that get object or 404, that pretty much like it's like a built-in wrapper and error handler.
Yeah, it's essentially a built-in error handler. There's an error handler inside of it. If I take a look at it, it essentially runs a try and accept here.
Yeah.
So if it's successful, it returns my actual query. If it's not, it returns a 404 response with the pre-designated message that we saw. Does that answer your question, Jens?
Yes, and it looks like there's a lot there, so.
Yeah. It's all the things that Django knew we were gonna need, so it provides them for us so that we don't have to make them from scratch. There's also a get list of 404 in case you guys didn't see that. We're not going to cover that in today's material, but if you're interested, you could definitely take a look and see how this works so that you could utilize it when you're grabbing list of our Pokemon, of our instances of each individual model instead of one object. All right, it doesn't seem like there are any other questions. I don't see anything on the Whiskey Questions channel either. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward with our lecture here. All right. So far we covered how to be able to send specific parameters, both in integer or string formats. But if we remember from the Poke API when we were working with it, not only were we sending string or integer formats, or we weren't picking and choosing which one to send, we were able to choose or send both. You could look up a Pokemon by name, or you could look up a Pokemon by string. I mean, by its ID. Well, how does this work? How do I tell Django, hey, you could accept both. You don't have to only work with one of them. Well, that part comes pretty simple. All right. What we're going to do is we're going to create a converter. So this int inside of my URL parameters, let me bring it up here. This int is called a converter. It's saying when I receive this attribute or this parameter of ID, I am going to convert it to an integer. And that's exactly what we want. But now I want to create a converter that will do both. That will evaluate whether it should return a string or an integer and return the proper type, right? You could say, well, what if I just wanted it to, if I just put it as a string, I could do an if statement inside of my view to check if I can turn it into a number. And if I can't turn it into a number, then I can execute my functionality. Yes, essentially you can, But when you put things as a string, and just setting it as a string, you're opening up the doors for a lot of different input that we don't necessarily want. So we want to control this information and ensure that it's either a string or a number. So let's build this converter. And you would want to create a converters.py in case you want multiple converters. Within the lecture, we're only going to create one, but the option to create multiple is there. So this one is going to be a built-in Django functionality. We don't have to actually make anything or import anything. I can go ahead and say class int or string. And actually, I'm going to try to resemble the lecture as much as I can. I'm going to establish a regex that's to be utilized within this class, which this regex is just going to check, hey, the only things that we are going to accept here are going to be integer or string. And actually, I don't need to pass in the R value. I can just say this is going to be the regex attribute of this class. It is going to accept 0 through 9 with one or more instances, or it is going to accept A through Z in lowercase letters or A through Z in uppercase letters with one or more instances. That's going to be the regex attribute of this class. From there, I'm going to give it two methods. One, to Python, which is what gets returned to my program. And then one to URL, which is what the URL can be evaluated as. Well, the URL one is pretty simple. It's always going to be a string. Right? That's what we want to return to the URL. It's always going to be interpreted as a string within the URL pattern. But in Python, that's where we can actually change what we're going to be working with. So we can run if value is a digit. So if I can turn this into a digit, and I'm doing that wrong, it's is digit, then I would want to return an integer of value. All right, that's going to give me an integer type. Else, I am going to return the string type of value. And that's it as far as converters go. One, it needs an attribute that it's supposed to match through regex to the URL pattern. So I'm telling it only to accept numbers or alphabetical characters. I'm utilizing A through Z and A through Z specifically because I don't want any other special characters. If you utilize something like \W, I believe it includes a couple of special characters that we don't necessarily want to accept. And I guess I could use \D back here, but I'm going to keep it to that 0 to 9 for now. All right. This is our URL converter. Does anyone have any questions over either one of these methods, what they do, and how they work? We haven't put it to practice yet, but I want to make sure that we cover this information. Oh, thank you, DJ. The \W also includes for digits. Got it. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move into putting this into practice. Well, I've made this converter. So how do I use it within my URL patterns? Well, in order to use it within my URL patterns, I have to register this set converter. So from Django.urls, we imported path, and we can import the converter registry. So I'm going to say, I want you to register the following converter. I'm going to say register converter, pass in the class that I want to register. So I can say from dot converters import int or string. This will accept the first argument, the class that I want to use. and then how I want to reference it. So I'm just going to say int or string. All right. So now I've registered the converter. How do I use it? I can change my path. And instead of specifying int here, I can say int or string. All right, so let's work through this backwards, right? I receive the request and an ID gets passed. Well, when this URL pattern gets triggered, it's going to find the match for int or string. It finds int or string right here. And it says, well, this is supposed to utilize the int or string converter. So then I'll open up the int or string converter. It will check the regex against the URL pattern. If the regex is successful, then it will define or interpret the value into the URL pattern as a string. And to my Python code inside of my function, I'll either receive an integer or a string. All right. Does anyone have any questions over registering a converter and how that connects to my URL patterns?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Edge.
Um, it's not necessarily clear to me where we're actually comparing the input to the regex.
Got it. So this regex is a class attribute. And what's happening is because this is going to be a registered converter, Python in the background is going to look for the attribute named regex when I go ahead and send a request. Once it finds that attribute named regex, it then compares the ending of the URL pattern that's getting passed as a parameter to this regex and ensures that it's successful. If it matches, then it moves to the methods, and if it doesn't match, then it throws an error. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it's just built into that class that we've created already.
Right. It's built in with Django. And the reason why
Okay.
this attribute gets looked for is because it is a converter that has been registered.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
Go ahead, Yams.
So back in that converters.py, the attribute regex must be explicitly regex, just spelled like that, and nothing else, or else that won't work.
Yeah, you want to specify this attribute by the name of regex because Django will be looking for it once it
That
gets.
can't be like RE, can't be like capital regex, can't be regex. Anything has to be spelled exactly with that.
I have to look up the actual naming conventions. Let me go ahead and take a look here. Registered converters type name converter. Yeah, it has to be named actual regex. So here's the string and integer converters that come built in with Django. I was able to find them. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly how I found them, but we found them. And we could see that here is the regex for only integer. It's only allowing 0 through 9. And here is the regex that it's using for string. It has to explicitly be named regex since that is the attribute that it will be looking for. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's something I might have overlooked if I didn't know that. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, no problem at all. All right. So now let's put this regex into practice. What does it look like when I go ahead and send a couple of requests? I'm going to bring back this handy dandy Django REST framework. I'm going to send my GET request to make sure it still works with an integer. Okay, so it still worked with an integer. But now what's going to happen when I send a string? All right, so instead of 1, I'm going to go ahead and do Pikachu. When I get a huge error, it's telling me ID field expected a number but got Pikachu. Well, now you would think, well, my converter is saying that this is to return it as a string, and it is returning it as a string. That's not where the error is coming from. we have to be careful when we're reading through these, especially because the Django errors come a little bit nested. If we go all the way to the top, or towards the top, we can see that we get a couple of problems here. So invalid literal for integer with base 10 Pikachu. So at somewhere it tried to turn Pikachu, which is a string, into an integer. Well, where is that coming from? I know where it's coming from, but I was hoping that I could find it here within the errors. It doesn't seem like I can. But where this is coming from is from my views. If I take a look at my views, I am telling it to look into the ID field, which we know that we established within our model as an integer type, right? If I take a look at my model here, ID is established as an integer type. It doesn't show it within the model, but I can take a look at my initial migration. And here we can see that ID is a big auto field for a specific number type, right? So it's trying to run a string in this get method, but this string is expecting a number. So this get object or 404 isn't working correctly just yet, right? Instead, I want to evaluate if ID is a string. And if it is equal to a string, then Pokemon should be equal to get object or 404, passing the Pokemon class or name is equal to ID dot title. Otherwise, Pokemon should be get object or 404, where the ID matches the ID. So now if I send my request again, it worked. It was able to grab Pikachu. I passed this dot title to give my user a little bit of freedom. All right, my Pikachu can now be spelled in whatever way I wanted to. And when I send the request, it gets formatted to be Pikachu. Now notice that it turned it all into a lowercase string. That's for my toURL function within my converter. All right, so I fixed this view by identifying what it is that my type of my request is coming back in, if I'm receiving an ID or a string, and then I am returning this function. So now that I have one specific Pokemon, I can then serialize that Pokemon and return its data. Does anyone have any questions over how we can register converters and handle the different ID values within our views? All right, I don't see any questions, but just in case, I'm going to go ahead and do an overview over everything we've done up to this point before moving on to our next topic. All right. So we determined that we wanted our API to be able to accept both integer and string parameters. But we came across the problem that Django currently only accepts integer or string. It does not accept both as a parameter and handle for both types as a parameter. So how could I handle this? Well, I had to create a converter that would be able to accept both and return the proper data type. Well, I went over to my converters file. I made a class, integer or string, with a specific regex. This regex will match the URL pattern to be 0 through 9, which is an integer with one or more instances, or alphabetical letters with one or more instances. If the URL pattern matches, then it returns the correct values. It evaluates if it is a digit. If it is, it will return an integer type to my function. If it is not, it returns a string type to my function. We could see that in progress here. So I just sent Pikachu over as a string. And if I were to send an integer, we can see that it returns EV for the integer of 5. Well, if it didn't match my regex, if I put an @ there and I send that, it's going to tell me, hey, we don't have anything, or there's no URL pattern that works with this parameter because it did not match my regex that I set up. So because it didn't match my regex, I have to send an actual number or a string that of letters. No special characters are being accepted here. So this is great. I got my integer converter working. But how did I connect that to my views? Well, I went back over to my URLs. I registered this converter into my Django framework. And then I used it within my URL parameters to specify that the parameter ID can be either an integer or a string. Finally, I connected it to my view where I check the type of ID. If it is a string, which is what my converter returned, then it will grab my Pokemon by title. I mean, by name, I apologize. And if it is an integer type, it goes into my else statement and it grabs the Pokemon by ID. Finally, we serialize the Pokemon and return its data attribute. Does anyone have any questions over converters? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. So finally, let's move on into testing our API endpoints. Gonna start closing everything. I'm just gonna leave my name, my URL parameters for both my move app and my Pokemon app. And I'm actually gonna take this down here. All right, so testing, just like models, it is imperative that we test our API endpoints by mocking or pinging their behavior. It may seem like an extra unnecessary work, but as our project becomes more complex, running unit tests will give us the extra layer of security to ensure we didn't break anything within our application. All right, so that's the reason why we're gonna be writing tests for API views. We want tests for models, we want tests for serializers, tests for validators, and we want tests for API views. So our test for API views is gonna make sure that our API view is returning the correct response within a specific format. So let's go into building this information. I'm going to go over to the test within my Pokemon test here. And I'm going to make a new class. And it looks like we're going to have to go a little bit into folder structure here. So let's go ahead and change that information as well. So I currently have this backend directory that has my Move app, my Poke API project, and my Pokemon app. And so far it's been working great. But as my test suite grows, I want to maybe consolidate some of my tests. All right. So inside of each individual app, I could have a directory named test. So I can change directory into my Pokemon app. From there, I can make a directory named tests. If I open that up, I can see that now there is a test directory. I currently have this test file that I can move in there. And I'm just going to rename this file. Rather than tests, it's going to be test models.py because that is holding all of my tests pertaining to my model. Now you can see that this caused a little bit of an import statement or an import issue. All I have to do is specify where this is coming from. So I can say from Pokemon app.models import my Pokemon. And now it's able to recognize it within the module, grab the correct file, and return the correct information. Good. So I should be able to test this file. All I'm going to say is Python manage py. Oh. I am going to run test. But the place that I'm going to execute test, or I wanted to look for test, is within Pokemon app/test. Okay, so there we can see that I even got my print statement here. Somewhere I print the e.message in one of our previous lectures. But we can see that both tests were identified and that they were executed properly. It's great. It worked, and I have the correct information. Well, now I'm going to make a new file named test views. And this is where I'm going to place all of the tests pertaining to my views. So now how do I go about doing that? Well, in this test views, I'm going to go ahead and create a class named, I was telling it I want you to test my views. So I'm going to say class test views. And I forgot to import this case from Django. So from Django.test import test case. There's a couple of other things that we'll utilize, but I'm not going to import them until we're actually using them. And now I'm going to say test case. Now I'm trying to test out my API view responses. But as we can see here from when I ran my test earlier for my models, it tells me that it creates a new database named default, and it then destroys that database. So none of my data of what I currently have within my API is being reflected within this test database. What can I use, or where else am I storing the information of my database within my Django application? Go ahead, Brian.
Fixtures?
Perfect. Yeah, fixtures. My fixtures are holding all of my information. So this class can accept the attribute of fixtures. So I'm telling it, hey, when you create this test database, I want you to load the data from the following fixtures. I'm going to have Pokemon data.json, which I believe that's what I called it. Good. And I don't have any fixtures for my app, so I'll have to create some. Let's go ahead and make some fixtures, and I'll make that here shortly. All right, and then move data.json. Good. So now it's going to, when it creates this test database, it's also going to utilize both of these fixtures to create this information. Again, I don't have any fixtures for move app, so I'm going to make some real quick. I'm going to dump data from move app dot move. I'm going to indent it by 2 so that it's easy to read. And I want to dump this within move app in the fixtures directory with the name move data.json. And there it is. There's my move data.json. If I click on it, I can see that I have a couple of tests already being provided. I mean, a couple of models with their many-to-many field relationships. Let's make sure that this is reflected by our Pokemon app as well. So I'm going to dump data to make sure that I have the newest version of my data from the Pokemon app.pokemon. I am also going to indent it by 2. And I want it to go into my Pokemon app fixtures, Pokemon data.json. All right, so here's my fixtures, my Pokemon data.json. All right, good. So I have my Pokemon data being imported. I have everything set up. It grabs my data for Pokemon first before making my move data, which is great because of that many-to-many relationship, right? I want to make sure that Pokemon exist prior to my move data. So I'm importing my JSON data in the correct format. And now I can actually go about testing each individual endpoint to match some sort of answer. So let's make this method. Test 01 get all Pokemon. This is OP, so it's going to take in self. And kind of just like how we did in JavaScript, we want to make a variable named response and make that to the request. So I'm going to get from, and I'm going to get from the URLs. Let me go ahead and comment this one out here. URLs that returns all Pokemon. So that's the idea of what I want. But there's a couple of missing things here. Django shouldn't be making the request. A client should be making this request, right? So if a client should be making this request, we need to find a way to mock the behavior of a client. Well, Django knows that. So it gives us a class for a client. So now for every single test that I have, I'm going to need a client. If I ever have anything that I'm going to repeat over and over again, that sounds like it should be its own behavior, right? So this is going to fall under a separate method. This method will be called the setup method. And the setup method is pretty simple. It's going to run the setup method prior to running any test. So it's going to make sure that this happens before any test is executed. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to create an attribute for client. I'm going to say client is equal to a client instance. This way I don't have to do it over and over again within each individual test. Well, now how do I make this line of code? I'm going to say response is equal to self.client. This is accessing this client attribute here. Think about the setup method kind of like as an init. All right, if I go into self, it's going to go into the setup method and grab the client from setup. And my client is going to run a GET request. Now, which URL pattern is it that I want it to run to? Now, as a developer, I need to work quickly. Django knows I need to work quickly. So because it knows I need to work quickly, it gives me the ability to give specific endpoints a parameter of name. So here I'm going to add a name and say all Pokemon. Well, how do I ping this URL endpoint by name? All right, I want to ping it by its attribute name. Inside of my views, I'm going to import a function named reverse, which comes from Django URLs. And what this reverse function is going to do is it's going to let me ping a URL path by its name parameter of all Pokemon. All right, so it will go back, find the name of all Pokemon, and then trigger this API view. So rather than typing in HTTP 127.001/Pokemon/ whatever comes after that, I just have to reference it by its specific name. Awesome. Well, let's take a look at what that does for now. I'm going to go ahead and assert self.assert. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to assert that true is equal to true, which will obviously come back successful. And I'm going to print the response content, which is going to be the body of this response. Let's take a look at what that does. I'm going to run this test. For testing views. Okay, so that failed because I am currently trying to access a file within Django and it's saying, hey, you can't do this. If you're trying to access a file, you got to utilize dot notation, which is fine. I'll just change my path from slashes to dot notation. So I'm still saying Python manage py, the Pokemon app module inside of the test module, execute the file, test views. Okay, and it ran. It ran really well. And it even shows me the body of my response as a binary string. We can see that the body of my response was correct. It returns the correct information for my Pokemon. If I were to ping this from my server, it would do the same thing. I'm not running my server, nor is it utilizing my PostgreSQL database. This is utilizing the test database default that it creates on its own. So here we can see I am executing this file. It found one test. It then created a test database named default that it loaded all of my JSON data as fixtures into. It then moved into executing test01, where it sets up a client. That client ran a GET request to the URL pattern with the name of all Pokemon. Here we see the name of all Pokemon. That then triggers my class with the method of GET. It grabs all of the Pokemon, serializes all of the Pokemon, and returns the .data attribute from that serialized class. And that's what we see here as the body of our content, which is what we expected. We want this to be we want this to happen every single time. So how do I ensure that this response stays the same? Well, there's a couple of different ways to do this. What I like to do to make things clean is I just simply make a new file named answers.py. And here I'm going to make an all Pokemon variable that I am going to save my body to. So there's all of my Pokemon. Well, now in my test view, I need to say from dot answers import all Pokemon. And now I have access to that variable with the response that I wanted to have. So how do I make a comparison for this response? Well, I need to, one, turn this binary string into actual data that I can work with Python. So how do I turn a binary string with a JSON format into workable data with Python? We've seen this a couple of times before. What do I need to use? Go ahead, Tom.
Just that JSON loads method.
Perfect. So I'm going to import JSON, and I'm going to utilize JSON.loads. So now JSON.loads into my response content. And let's make sure that worked. When I execute it, now I don't get a binary string. I get a list of dictionaries that comes back. So good. Let's go ahead and say JSON response is equal to JSON.loads. And finally, for my assertion, I want to assert equals. And what I want to assert is that my all Pokemon variable from my answers file is the same as my JSON response. So now when I run it, I'll always receive the same response as long as I do not break my code or change something within my serializer. And we just built out our very first test. Does anyone have any questions over how tests for testing API endpoints are built or their benefits and what they bring to the table? All right, I'm not seeing any questions. So let's move into building a test that will take in an attribute as well in our parameter, such as getting a Pokemon. So here we are, we're gonna make test 2, which is get a Pokemon. And in this case, we're gonna say we're gonna grab that Pokemon by name. It's still going to take in self. And now I'm gonna make my client make a request. This request is going to be to the URL with the name a Pokemon. If I take a look at my URL patterns, that doesn't exist yet, so I have to make it. Let's go with name a Pokemon. You can kind of see the pattern in my name convention. I'm kind of resembling the actions of what's going on here. This has to do with all of my Pokemon. So I'm naming it all Pokemon. This has to do with a Pokemon. So I'm naming it a Pokemon. Good. So now I go into my test views. That reverse function should work. But this reverse function isn't just expecting a get request. It's also looking for an actual attribute, right? It's expecting an argument. Well, what else do I need to pass into my test views in order for this to work properly? Well, in this reverse function, not only am I going to pass the name, but I'm also going to pass the arguments that I should utilize. And in this case, the argument that I will use will be Pikachu. So now Pikachu is what will get passed as the integerized or string parameter for ID. Good. After that, everything is pretty much the same. I go into a JSON response. I'll make that equal to json.loads. And I'm going to then grab the response.content. I'm going to print JSON response. And I'll go ahead and do self.assert true. I'm going to run this views. We can see that both of them came back okay. That print statement for a JSON response was triggered. So here we can see that it gives me back my Pikachu. I'm going to grab Pikachu and place it within my answers here. So a Pokemon, the answer will be this dictionary for Pikachu. I'll import that variable of a Pokemon. And then I'll assert that my JSON response is equal to my a Pokemon. I run my request and everything comes back okay. All right. Quick overview of the test suite. We made a test file. When this file gets executed, it will create a database. That database needs data, so we utilize the fixtures from Pokemon data.json and move data.json to create data within our database. We then create a setup method that will create a client that can send requests to our Django backend. In test 01, this client sends a get request to the URL with the name of all Pokemon. If I go to this URL, we can see all Pokemon gets triggered. It triggers our API view to get all Pokemon from our database, serializes these Pokemon, and it returns their data. We then assert that that is what we expect it to be and that it matches our answers file. In test 02, we utilize the same client to send a request to a Pokemon, but a Pokemon is also expecting an argument for ID. So within my views, I tell it that the argument that it will use is Pikachu. It then passes Pikachu to my view as ID. Since the type of ID was a string, it gets an object or 404 from the Pokemon model where the name is the same as the parameter ID with the title format. So that will grab Pikachu out of my database. It will serialize said Pokemon and return its data attribute. That gets stored under the response content, which we load with JSON.loads. And then we assert that it's the same as the answer that we have in our answer file. And that is it for testing your API views. Does anyone have any questions over writing tests for API views? I can see a question on the chat. It says, I thought the serializers give back JSON type data. Is this incorrect? Just wondering why we need to utilize JSON.loads. No, that is definitely correct. So the serializer does return a JSON data structure, but that data structure isn't received by Python, by Django, right? We're mocking a client sending this request. So an HTTP request is getting sent out and is being received by this client. And that's what's happening here in response. Anything that has to be sent through the body of a request will be interpreted as binary string. So because our response, even though it was sent out in JSON format, it still comes back as a binary string. And that's why we need to utilize JSON.loads. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
Yeah, I don't know. It's just a lot of information. So I think I'm getting confused on different points.
No, that makes sense. And it definitely is quite a bit so far. Our Django is growing. Go ahead, Yams.
So I noticed that in order to get the answer for get all Pokemon, we had to first make the request and then copy the response, the response that we received, and then we put that in the answer. So the test is passing now, but if the user adds a Pokemon to the database, would this test then fail afterwards?
That's a great question. Yeah, so
it doesn't seem dynamic is why.
Yeah, right. This is not a dynamic way of running tests. I understand. I get what you're asking. So pretty much as my program grows, how do I make sure this is working efficiently? Well, so far we've been working with data or Pokemon data that we ourselves have been storing into our database, right? But at some point, we're going to decide what our fixtures should look like and how they should be maintained. So fixtures should eventually not be touched at all, right? We're eventually going to stop dumping data into this fixture file, or we'll have separate fixtures for maintaining our data and fixtures specifically dedicated for test. The fixture specifically dedicated for tests is what will maintain this test suite to ensure that the correct responses are coming back. Does that answer your question, Jens?
Yeah, I guess I have to see it, but from what I understand is that at that point when we get to it, it'll become dynamic and take care of itself.
Right. It's not exactly that we're looking for it to be dynamic, right? Because if I just run, is this the same thing as if I were to grab, so if I were to use my Pokemon serializer on Pokemon dot objects dot all, and then I pass in the many equals true, right? And I want to make sure that my JSON response is the same, right? I could run this assert equals, and this would make it dynamic essentially because it would query my database, and then it would make sure that that's the same thing that comes back from my JSON response. But then if somebody changes something within my serializer, well, now my response is in a complete different format. Right? This would still come back true, but it could give me false true information. Because what if my front end is expecting this format that's within my fixtures or within my answers file? What if the front end team is expecting that format to come back? Well, if I change my serializer, it's not going to throw an error. It's just going to give them data in the wrong format. Does that make sense, Jens?
Yeah, I can see that too.
All right, great. Thank you so much, everyone. If there are no other questions, today we covered what are class-based views, the differences and commonalities between function-based views and class-based views. A view that interacts with your model is known as a model view controller, and that's what we did here through our API views. We covered linking our URL patterns between projects and apps, creating an all Pokemon view, and all moves view. We created a Pokemon view, which returned one specific Pokemon. And we did that while creating our own URL converter, passing parameters through the URL inside of Django. And then we covered how to create API tests through API views. Does anyone have any questions over any of the topics that we covered today? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.